Our next speaker is Professor Robert Trager. Professor Trager is co-director of the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative, Senior Research Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, and International Governance Lead at the Center for the Governance of AI. He is a recognized expert in the international governance of emerging technologies, diplomatic practice, institutional design, and technology regulation. Professor Trager regularly advises governments and industry leaders on these topics. Robert, I'll pass it on to you.
Right. I'm so glad to be here and to be with you. And I must say, particularly because this whole day we can really feel the sense of common purpose that I think we all have while we're here and while we're trying to solve these incredibly difficult challenges that affect all of us as a globe. So what I thought I could do today is to give us maybe one vision of what an ecosystem could look like that could be a global ecosystem for regulating AI governance. So I guess I thought I would start with some of the reasons why, not all of the reasons, but some of the reasons why we need to do this and why we need to do it internationally. But I think others have already talked about this, so I won't go into too many details, but I think it's clear to those of us who are here in this room that if there's some misuse case, for instance, that's enabled, let's say cyber misuse, that's enabled in one part of the world, then that will have effects on the rest of the world. So that's just one example among many that suggests we really do need to tackle these problems together. And just in the interest of time, I will move on to thinking about international institutions, and in particular from a safety perspective, three things that I think we need to do. And the first of those is to develop international standards. So we need to come together, we need to figure out how to do that. Those standards have to be legitimate, they have to be standards that we all have the opportunity to feed into. So that's the first thing we have to do. The second thing we have to do probably is set incentives for adoption at the international level. So it's one thing to have principles, but it's another thing to have incentives that mean that we have a governance system that everyone hopefully is adopting and buying into. And the third thing that we'll need to do is cooperate in particular ways to animate a regime like this. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about each of these things that we can do. And I should say, before I get into the first of those three, that I think there are many other parts of an AI governance ecosystem, particularly if we're thinking about AI for development, which is extremely important and a place where China has taken the lead in the recent AI resolution. But I'm focusing today on these safety issues, although I think in many ways the safety issues and the ways that we would deal with them can be broadened out to deal with a whole range of other issues. So, setting standards, how do we do that? Well, we have some particular problems in the area of safety. It's a little bit different than the way that standards get set in other areas, because first of all, it's a research problem. It's cutting edge research itself. So safety standards, standards usually are distilling bodies of knowledge. So distilling bodies of knowledge is one thing, and it's a very important thing, and that's what traditional standards institutions are very good at. But what we need to do today also involves frontier research. And some of the standards organizations are currently building capacity in order to be able to do that. But nevertheless, it's a difficult challenge for them. So the safety institutes, or as we've recently heard, the safety networks that may exist in some countries, are one place where that seems to be happening, but we need to get those institutes or networks together to form broader networks, and we need to be sure that there is voice from the whole world into these processes, which also involves some capacity building to make sure that all parts of the globe can actually participate in these different processes. So that's one of the things we need to do. Actually, I jumped there to the third one. I guess I was really interested in that one. But the first two are very important too. We need to consensus on the areas that really need to be internationalized. That's the first one. Because probably not all areas really require internationalization. The US and Europe and China, for instance, have taken somewhat different paths when it comes to privacy regulation. Well, this reflects different societal values, and in a way that's part of the reason why we have different countries, so that different cultural spaces can decide how to govern themselves differently. So that may not be an area where we need to have full internationalization of standards. But then other areas, like some of the safety questions that we've been focused on here today, probably we do need to think about some international standards. But which specific areas do we need to consensus on standards? We need to consensus on that as a first priority. And then we need to consensus on risks. As you've also heard today, not everybody agrees on the set of risks that we have today. So we need to consensus on that. And we need to generally coordinate across areas of government like the safety institutes and safety networks, also civil society, academia, and industry, where a lot of the work on developing things like model evaluations is in fact happening now. Okay, I think maybe I should just emphasize also this last point very quickly that says that we really need to be sure that these processes are legitimate when we're creating standards and that all have a voice. Okay. Right. The next thing we need to do is figure out some way of setting incentives at the international level. And this is often a question, if we think about the model regimes that we have in other industries, this is often a question of figuring out what sort of governance capacities will exist at the international level and what will exist at the domestic level and how those things interact. So if we think about these three models that I have up here today, the FATF and ICAO and the International Maritime Organization, all three of those, and indeed others in the international system, have a few things in common. So we're talking, if we take the example maybe of ICAO, ICAO is not auditing individual companies to understand or to enforce any sort of regulation. It doesn't look at Air China, and it doesn't look at American Airlines, and it doesn't look at British Airways. What it does is help to, one, develop standards that all countries in the world have input into, and it also goes and looks at jurisdictions to be sure that they have appropriate regulatory apparatus. And sometimes these organizations actually look to see if there's a track record of enforcing appropriate regulations. And so how does that give sort of teeth to an international system? Well, there we can shift over again to the domestic level. So what happens, for instance, in the civil aviation regime is that some countries around the world will say, well, you can't enter our airspace unless, or that is, flights originating from a jurisdiction can't enter an airspace unless they're compliant with ICAO rules. So that's something that an individual country can decide to do itself But when individual countries, particularly if a lot of countries decide to do that, then it gives a real incentive to comply with the international standards. So we can imagine something like that happening also in the case of AI. For instance, you can imagine that countries might say, well, we're not going to import any technology whose supply chains involve AI from jurisdictions that aren't compliant with international standards. And we can talk about many other ways of providing some of those incentives, but these are the kinds of things that I think we need to be talking about. Something else that is also important is this last point on the slide here, mutual recognition of some regulatory outcomes. This is something that we have in many other industries. To take the aviation example again, if a plane is built in China, it goes through a regulatory process. Or if a plane is built in the United States, it goes through a regulatory process. And the outcome of those regulatory processes is shared with the other country. And the full regulatory process doesn't need to be engaged in the other country. What they're looking at is the outcomes to be sure that the same sort of certifications that have happened in the one country can happen in the other country. So this also is the kind of thing that we have done in other areas. There are some particular challenges in the case of AI, but it's the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about doing. Final pillar here is cooperation, different forms of cooperation that help to animate and make really vibrant an international regime. So one thing that we might think about is an international reporting regime for both AI developers and for compute providers. So first of all, this would give us visibility into what is happening around the world. It would help everybody to understand if, for instance, some actor were trying to avoid a governance regime, say by structuring the training of a model to be sure that only a certain amount of training were happening in one jurisdiction and a certain amount were happening in another jurisdiction, then a reporting regime like that could be very helpful. And again, we do reporting regimes like that in other industries. We cooperate in those ways. So for instance, to take the example of finance, it's much easier to catch someone who's trying to violate a regulatory regime and do money laundering if all the different jurisdictions are cooperating to report to each other, and then you can figure out that somebody is trying to avoid rules. Now, if we start down the path like this with a reporting regime, then it helps many aspects of governance and it can grow over time. So one idea that's currently out there that people have discussed is a reporting regime for large models. In fact, the US Commerce Department has proposed that US cloud providers will need to report to the US government when a very large model is being trained on their systems. Now, as you can imagine, this is not popular in certain quarters. In fact, it's not popular almost anywhere in the world, and it's particularly unpopular with US cloud providers themselves because they know that their customers don't like it. If there's a French customer training on a US cloud provider, that French customer doesn't want to report or doesn't want things reported about what they're doing to the US government. So from some quarters, this provides a push for more of an international regime. And I would say one of the interesting things to think about is the way that a regime like that can grow over time to take on more capacities over time. So again, to use the example of finance, in finance, banks are intermediaries. So they stand between governments and customers as a site for regulation. So if a customer raises a red flag, then jumping ahead, financial resources may be denied to that customer until red flags could be resolved. That's a very blunt instrument, but it's the kind of thing that at some point we could think about where compute resources would require the passing of regulatory checks in a very similar way. So if we started a reporting regime like that now, it could expand over time to take on some of those other capabilities. Right, so I think I'll just end by saying that I think what we need is an ecosystem. We haven't talked at all about development and the role that organizations like UNESCO and the ITU are playing both at the United Nations, which is important for development. UNESCO, for instance, evaluates countries at their request to see if their AI strategies are in line with a set of ethical principles. So these kinds of things, which are welcomed by states around the world, I think are very useful, and there are many sorts of capacity building that we also need to be talking about. But maybe I'll just end by saying that from a safety point of view, these three different pillars, I think, is one way to think about the challenge before us. We need to think about creating standards that are both cutting-edge technology, but also part, when they become internationalized, of a legitimating process that includes broad-based voice for the whole world. And then we also need to think about setting incentives at the international level. So we talked about some of the ways that can happen. And we also need to think about the different steps we can take to really animate the regime and make sure that we have the kinds of reporting that mean that we can figure out when somebody is doing something they're not supposed to do. So thank you again. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you all.
Thank you, Robert. You outlined very clear and concrete steps towards an international standards and reporting regime on AI safety, and I look forward to diving into this later in the panel discussion. Next, we have